She stepped off that train believing in a promise. She stepped back onto the platform believing in nothing. In the brutal autumn of 1878, Eleanor Hart traveled 800 miles across the American frontier for a man who had written her letters full of warmth and certainty. She arrived with a single trunk, calloused hands, and the kind of desperate hope that only the truly lonely carry. What she received instead was public humiliation so vicious it drew laughter from strangers. What she could not have known, what nobody on that dusty platform could have predicted, was that the worst moment of her life was also the first moment of her real one. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The train smelled like coal smoke, wet wool, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's bones after 3 days of hard travel with nowhere decent to sleep. Eleanor Hart sat upright in the last car, the cheapest seats, the ones with the hard wooden benches and the drafty gap under the door that let the October wind slice through no matter how many layers you wore. She had 2 layers. A wool dress that had been washed so many times the brown had faded to something closer to the color of dead leaves, and a coat that had belonged to her mother and was slightly too narrow across the shoulders. Eleanor had broad shoulders. She always had. It was one of the things people mentioned when they described her, usually not as a compliment. She was 26 years old, and she had not slept properly in 4 days. In her lap sat a letter. She didn't need to read it anymore. She had memorized it sometime around the second week after it arrived, back in Cincinnati, back when she still had a job at the textile mill, and a room she shared with 2 other women and a cat that belonged to neither of them. The letter was from a man named Gerald Whitmore, a merchant operating out of a frontier town called Dunmore's Creek, Colorado Territory. He had found her through a matrimonial advertisement that Eleanor had placed in a regional paper, a small, carefully worded thing that had cost her nearly a week's wages and a considerable amount of pride. Capable woman, 26, seeks honest partner for frontier life. Not afraid of hard work, reliable. She had not described herself as beautiful. She had known better than that. Gerald Whitmore's first letter had been formal but warm. He had described his store, his small but solid income, his desire for a practical wife who understood that frontier life required toughness as much as tenderness. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that he was not a romantic man, but that he intended to be a fair one. That word, fair, had done something to Eleanor that she was still a little embarrassed about. It had made her cry. Not because fair was beautiful, but because fair was more than she'd had in a long time. They had exchanged 6 letters over 4 months. Then Gerald Whitmore had sent her a train ticket and written, "I believe we understand each other well enough. Come in October before the passes close." So here she was. October. Passes not yet closed. Eleanor Hart, 800 miles from everything she knew, holding a letter from a man she had never met, riding toward a life she had constructed entirely out of words on paper. She looked out the window. The mountains were visible now, distant and white-capped, stacked against a sky so blue it almost hurt. She had never seen anything like them. In Cincinnati, the landscape was flat and gray and smelled of the river. This was something else entirely, something that made her chest feel strange. Not quite fear, not quite awe, something that lived between the two. The woman sitting across from her, a stout widow traveling to visit her daughter, had been making conversation on and off since Pueblo. "First time out west?" the widow asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You'll find it different." She said it with the tone of someone who had seen many young women come out west and had opinions about how that tended to go. "I expect so." "What brings you?" Eleanor hesitated. "Getting married?" The widow looked at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Not unkind, exactly. Just measuring. "He a good man?" "I believe so." "Believing and knowing are 2 different things out here, honey." Eleanor folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket. "I know that." She didn't say anything else, and after a moment, the widow went back to her knitting. The train pulled into Dunmore's Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon. Dunmore's Creek was not a beautiful town. It sat at the edge of the foothills like something that had been dropped there by accident and hadn't quite decided yet whether to stay or fall apart. The main street was wide and muddy from recent rain, bordered on both sides by wooden storefronts with painted signs in various states of weather damage. There was a saloon, 2 general stores, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of other businesses that Eleanor cataloged in the first 30 seconds out of habit, the same way you cataloged a room when you entered it, quickly and without making it obvious. About 20 people were on the platform when the train pulled in. Some were waiting for cargo. A few were travelers stretching their legs. A small cluster near the far end of the platform appeared to be waiting specifically for the train's arrival. Men in work clothes, one woman in a blue dress. And at the center of the cluster, a man Eleanor recognized from the description he had provided in his letters. Gerald Whitmore was perhaps 40, stocky, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of broad, ruddy face that looked like it could be friendly or unpleasant, depending on the circumstances. He was wearing a good coat. He had his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. He was watching the train with the careful attention of a man conducting a business transaction. Eleanor stepped off the car and onto the platform, and she was aware, the way you sometimes are when something important is happening, that this was one of those moments that would be divided into before and after. She had her trunk. The porter set it beside her. She straightened her coat, the too narrow one, and picked up her traveling bag and walked toward Gerald Whitmore with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had practiced this approach in her mind approximately 400 times. He saw her at about 10 feet. She watched his face. She had spent a lot of her life watching faces because faces told you things before people's mouths did. She had learned this at the mill, where a foreman's expression at the start of the day told you whether quotas had been raised before he opened his mouth to tell you. She had learned it as a child, reading her father's face across the dinner table to determine whether he was in the kind of mood that ended in shouting. Gerald Whitmore's face told her something very clearly in the moment he saw her, and it was not anything she wanted to know. She watched his expression move through surprise, then something like calculation, and this was the part that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a particular kind of disgust that people wear when they feel cheated. He let her walk all the way up to him, let her get close enough that there was nowhere reasonable for her to go. "You're Eleanor Hart," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He looked at her, not quickly, slowly, the way you looked at livestock at a sale, top to bottom and back up. He didn't bother to hide it because she would later understand it did not occur to him that he should. "You didn't mention you were so—" He stopped, started again. "Your advertisement said capable." "I am capable." "It didn't say—" He made a vague gesture that encompassed apparently all of her. Her height, her shoulders, her broad hands and her strong jaw, and the fact that she was not small or delicate or any of the things women were supposed to be. One of the men in his cluster snorted. That was the sound that broke something open. Because once one person laughed, the dam broke, and within seconds several others were laughing too. And the woman in the blue dress had pressed her gloved hand over her mouth in the way people do when they're pretending not to find something funny while finding it very funny. And Gerald Whitmore seemed to stand a little taller, seemed to take actual pleasure in the moment, seemed to decide that this was better. Being the man who had been sent a joke of a woman was better than being no entertainment at all in a town that didn't have much. "She looks like she ought to be hauling freight," someone said. "More of a draft horse than a bride," another voice offered, and this got the biggest laugh. Eleanor stood in the center of it and felt something inside her go very still. She had been laughed at before. She had been called names before. She had been the girl at school who grew too fast and too big and never quite seemed to fit the expectations that people had about what a girl should look like. She had built walls around those experiences the way you built walls around anything you couldn't afford to feel all the way through. But she had traveled 800 miles. She had spent her savings on the advertisement and her remaining savings on the dress she was wearing, which she had made herself because she couldn't afford a dressmaker. She had read those letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had believed in something. Not a perfect life, she was too practical for that, but a fair one. He had promised her fair. She did not cry. She would not allow herself that. Not here. Not with 20 strangers watching. What she did was look at Gerald Whitmore directly and say very quietly, "You are not the man you represented yourself to be." He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but only slightly. "I never said—" "You said you wanted a capable woman. You said frontier life required toughness. You said you would be fair." "I meant—" "I know what you meant," Eleanor said, "and I know what you actually are." She picked up her traveling bag. Her trunk was still on the platform, 40 pounds of everything she owned. She had enough money left for perhaps 3 nights in a boarding house, if she was careful, and a train ticket back to Cincinnati if she didn't eat for 2 days. She had no job waiting for her in Cincinnati. She had given notice at the mill. Gerald Whitmore said, with the air of a man tying up loose ends, "I'll send someone for your trunk. You can take the eastbound next week." "I don't need you to send for anything." She walked away from him. She walked the length of the platform and down the steps onto the muddy street with her bag in her hand and the October wind cutting through her coat. And she walked until she turned a corner and she was out of sight of the platform. And then she stopped and put her hand against the side of a building and breathed. The wood was rough under her palm, real, cold. She pressed harder against it. "All right," she told herself. "All right, think." She spent 2 hours in that town trying to solve an unsolvable problem. The boarding house on the main street was run by a woman named Mrs. Putnam, who had the particular kind of sympathy for unfortunate women that came wrapped in pity and visible judgment. She gave Eleanor a room for the night, a small room, clean enough, with a window that rattled, and she told Eleanor the price of the eastbound train ticket, which was more than Eleanor had hoped, and she watched Eleanor's face while she said it in the way people watched faces when they expected bad news to show. Eleanor didn't let it show. She thanked Mrs. Putnam and went upstairs to sit on the edge of the narrow bed and do the arithmetic. The arithmetic was bad. She had enough for 3 nights in this room and the train ticket, but not both. She had the clothes on her back and the clothes in her trunk and a few tools she'd packed because she'd expected to be setting up a household. A good knife, a small hand axe, a sewing kit. She had no relatives to wire. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. She had an aunt in Pittsburgh who she hadn't spoken to in years over an argument she barely remembered now, and writing to that woman would be like admitting something she was not ready to admit. She sat on that bed for a long time. Outside her window, Dunmore's Creek went about its afternoon. Horses on the street, the sound of someone hammering somewhere, a dog barking and then stopping. The ordinary, indifferent sounds of a place that did not know her and did not care about her particular crisis. Eventually, she got up. She splashed water on her face from the basin. She put on her coat. She went back out. She went to the general store, not Whitmore's. There were 2 in town. And she asked the proprietor, an older man named Jensen, if there was any work available. He looked at her with the recognizing expression of someone who had already heard about the spectacle at the train station. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Any kind." He thought about it in the way people thought about things when they'd already decided but didn't want to say so directly. "Not much call for extra help this time of year," he said. "Winter coming, people are tightening up, not taking on." She tried the livery. Same result. She tried the saloon, which she had expected to be a long shot. They had a cook already. And the church, where the minister was polite and useless, and a seamstress's shop where the woman behind the counter clearly recognized her and had the grace not to say anything but also didn't have work. By late afternoon, Eleanor was standing outside Dunmore's Creek's second saloon, with the sun dropping behind the mountains and the temperature dropping with it, and she was beginning to understand in a very concrete way what it meant to have nowhere to go. She had known poverty before. The mill years had been hard, but she had always had the mill, always had the room, always had the particular ugly security of a bad situation that was at least a known bad situation. This was different. This was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar town with strangers who already thought of her as a joke, watching the sun go down, with 3 nights of roof over her head, and then nothing. She was cold, not just the October wind cold, cold in a deeper way. She turned to go back to the boarding house and nearly walked directly into a man who had apparently been standing a few feet behind her for some indeterminate amount of time. She startled back. He didn't move. He was big. Bigger than most men she'd encountered, and she'd grown up around mill workers who weren't small. He was perhaps 30 or a few years more, hard to tell with the kind of weathering that the outdoors put on a face. Dark beard, not neatly trimmed but not wild either, somewhere in between. A long canvas coat that had seen serious use. Boots that were built for function in a way that Whitmore's good coat was not. He carried himself with the specific quietness of a person who had spent a lot of time alone in places where noise got you into trouble. He was looking at her directly, which was unusual, because most people since the platform incident had been looking at her sideways or not at all. "You're Eleanor Hart," he said. Something in her tightened. "So everyone here seems to know." He didn't respond to that. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper and held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. "What is that?" "Whitmore's bill," he said. "What you owe him for the ticket." She stared at him. "I don't owe Gerald Whitmore anything. He sees it different. He's been to the marshal about it." He paused. "Train ticket he sent you was against your arrival. His terms were that you'd pay it back on settlement or it'd be counted as a debt." Eleanor felt the cold settle into her chest. "That wasn't in any letter." "I believe you." He said it simply, with no particular inflection. "Doesn't change what he's done." She looked at the paper. If Whitmore had gone to the marshal, and if the marshal was the kind of man who was friendly with the town's main merchant, and she had exactly zero reason to assume otherwise, then she had another problem on top of her existing problems. "How much?" she asked. He told her. It was almost exactly what she had left. She stood there for a moment just holding that reality. Then she said very carefully, "Why are you telling me this?" The man looked at her for a moment. The light was going orange and flat the end of the afternoon, and his face was hard to read in it. "Because I paid it," he said. But Chapter 4. What he said on the street. Eleanor stared at him. "You paid a debt you have nothing to do with," she said, "for a woman you've never met." "I have a reason." "Tell me the reason." He looked at her steadily. "I need a partner for my homestead. Winter is coming in fast and I'm short-handed. I've been watching you this afternoon walk around this town trying to find work and getting nowhere, and I figure you're in a bad spot and I'm in a bad spot, and maybe those two bad spots add up to something that works." "That's the strangest offer I've ever heard." "Probably," he said. He didn't seem particularly troubled by that. "My name is Caleb Thorne. I have a cabin about 18 miles up into the mountains. I've got 40 acres cleared, livestock, a winter's worth of work that needs doing. I'm not offering you marriage." He paused here, very deliberately. "I'm offering you a partnership. Equal share of what the land produces. Your own space, your own decisions. If it doesn't work, come spring you can leave with your portion, and I won't say a word about it." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the paper in his hand. The receipt, she realized, for the paid debt. She looked at the street around them, the town that had laughed at her, the boarding house at the end of the block where she had 3 nights, and then nothing. "Why didn't you just offer me employment?" she asked. "Instead of all this?" "Because I've had employees," Caleb Thorne said. "They leave when it gets hard. A partner has a stake." "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I watched you walk around this town for 2 hours after what happened on that platform. And you didn't cry, and you didn't beg, and you didn't go back to Whitmore. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" He seemed to think about it. "That you're worth the investment." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The wind was picking up. The mountains behind the town had gone purple and gray in the fading light. She thought about the eastbound train, about Pittsburgh and her aunt, and the admission that would cost her to walk up to that door. She thought about Cincinnati and the mill and the room she shared with 2 women and a cat. The particular grinding smallness of that life, the way each year had felt like the one before it. She thought about what this man had just said. A partner. "If I agree," she said, "and it doesn't work, you'll abide by that? Come spring, I go with my share and you have no claim on me." "You have my word." "Your word means something to you?" He looked at her with the first hint of something that might, with some generosity, be called amusement. "It's about the only thing I've got that I keep in good condition." Eleanor looked at him for one more long moment. Then she looked at the mountains. "I need my trunk," she said. "It's still on the platform." "I know where it is. Then let's get it." They left at first light the next morning. Eleanor had spent her last night in Mrs. Putnam's boarding house, lying in the dark with her eyes open, cataloging what she'd agreed to. A man she didn't know. A mountain she'd never seen. A partnership built entirely on one afternoon's worth of watching her refuse to fall apart in public. It was by any reasonable measure not a solid foundation. But the alternatives were worse. She had written a short note to her aunt in Pittsburgh, not asking for anything, just saying where she was going and with whom, in the way that you left a record when you were uncertain about something. She left it with Mrs. Putnam to mail. The widow who had been on the train had left already. Eleanor had no other witnesses to her location in this town. She told herself that was fine. She had only herself to rely on anyway. Caleb arrived at the boarding house at 6 in the morning with 2 horses and a loaded pack mule and the kind of unhurried efficiency that suggested this was simply what mornings looked like. He didn't explain the animals or the supplies. He tied Eleanor's trunk to the mule's pack without being asked and said, "Ready?" with the tone of someone who had thought about whether she might not be and had decided she probably was. "Ready," Eleanor said. Gerald Whitmore was, apparently, an early riser. He was standing outside his store when they came down the main street, and Eleanor saw him see her, saw the flash of something cross his face. Surprise, she thought, and then something uglier, something that she recognized as the particular rage of a man who had expected his cruelty to have its full desired effect and found that it hadn't. He took a step toward them. "Miss Hart." Caleb Thorne didn't stop his horse. He didn't look at Whitmore. He just kept riding, steady and unhurried. And Eleanor matched his pace, and after a moment Gerald Whitmore's voice fell behind them, and the sound of the horses on the mud was the only thing left. Eleanor didn't look back. She had a rule about looking back at things she'd decided to leave. The road, if you could call it that, climbed from the flat country around Dunmore's Creek up into the foothills in the first hour, and then into the mountains proper as the morning wore on. And it became progressively less of a road and more of a suggestion, a kind of shared understanding between previous travelers about where a path might be. The aspens had mostly turned. The hillsides were patched with the yellow gold of them, bright against the dark of the pine and fir above. The air at altitude was different from the town, cleaner in a way that was almost aggressive about it, cold in a way that felt honest rather than just uncomfortable. Eleanor's breath came out in clouds. Caleb rode ahead mostly. Not because he was ignoring her, but because the trail required single file in places and because he seemed to understand, without being told, that she needed some time inside her own head. She appreciated that. Around midday, they stopped at a creek crossing to rest the animals and eat. Caleb had packed dried meat and hard biscuits, frontier food, practical and flavorless, the kind of food that existed entirely to keep you moving. Eleanor ate without complaint. "How long have you had the homestead?" she asked. 4 years. He was watering the horses, not looking at her. "Came out after the war. Needed somewhere with more space between me and other people." "The war," she repeated. She didn't ask which war. There had only been one war that mattered in the last 20 years. "How long were you in?" 3 years. She didn't push on it. Men who had been in the war either wanted to talk about it or they didn't, and the ones who didn't had usually been in the parts of it that left marks. "The partnership," she said instead. "What does that actually mean? Day to day?" He straightened up from the creek, hands on his knees. "It means what needs doing gets done, and whoever can do it does it. I don't keep a list of man's work and woman's work. Out here it's just work. And the homestead is making enough to winter on. Was making enough for one, should still make enough for two." He paused. "Might be tight the first winter. I'll be straight with you about that." She considered that. Tight was something she understood. "What livestock do you have?" 2 horses, the ones we're riding, 2 more at the cabin, 3 goats, 8 chickens. The mule." He nodded toward the packed animal. "I put up a good amount of hay in summer. Garden did all right. I've got a smokehouse with meat in it. But you're short on winter labor." "My usual help, a man named Peterson. His wife had a baby in September and he stayed down in the valley. Wouldn't ask him to come up with a newborn." Eleanor nodded. "And your plan was to find someone before the snow?" "Yes." "And the matrimonial papers?" He looked at her. "I don't use the papers." "So how did you—" "I was at the post station when your letter to Whitmore came through," he said. "The postmaster's no good at keeping his mouth shut. I heard about it. I heard about the ticket." He looked back at the trail ahead. "I thought about it most of August." She stared at him. "You thought about me for 2 months before I even got here?" "I thought about the situation," he said, which Eleanor recognized as a careful distinction that might or might not mean something. The horses were rested. He stood and picked up his reins. "We should move," he said. "Want to make the cabin before dark." Eleanor stood too, stretching her back. 3 days on a train and now most of a day on horseback. She was sore in ways she expected to be more aware of tomorrow. She swung back into the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had ridden work horses as a girl, even if not recently. Caleb watched her mount without comment, but she noticed that he watched. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Just, you ride well. It was not a grand compliment. It was a simple, factual observation. But Eleanor had been on the receiving end of almost nothing but insults and pity for the past 24 hours. And something about the plainness of it, you ride well, no asterisk, no qualification, did something unexpected to the tightness she'd been carrying in her chest since the platform. She looked at the trail ahead and said, "Keep moving. I want to see this cabin." They rode into the afternoon, climbing. The cabin was better than she'd expected. Not fancy. Not anything close to fancy. 2 rooms, square-built log construction with the kind of careful chinking between the logs that said whoever had built it understood winters at altitude. A covered porch on the front. A separate, smaller structure behind it that turned out to be a combination smokehouse and storage shed. A barn that was modest but solid. A root cellar dug into the hillside with a heavy door. A garden plot, mostly cleared and turned for winter, that was larger than she'd expected given one man's labor. Eleanor stood in the yard and looked at it in the blue-gray light of late afternoon and thought involuntarily, someone worked very hard here. The inside was spare and practical. One room served as kitchen and main living space. A big iron stove, a heavy table, 2 chairs, shelving along the walls with supplies and tools organized with a thoroughness that surprised her. The other room was smaller, with a single bed and a trunk. Caleb showed her this room without particular ceremony. "You'll sleep here," he said. "I'll take the main room." "That's your bed." "I've slept by the stove before. It's warmer anyway." She looked at the room. It was clean. The blankets on the bed were worn but laundered. There was a small window facing east. "I'm not accustomed to taking someone's room," she said. "Get accustomed to it," he said. "Bed's better for someone who's been on a train for 3 days. We can work out a permanent arrangement later." She set her bag down. She hung her coat on the hook behind the door. She turned around and he was already gone. Back to the barn. She could hear him moving around out there, getting the horses settled. She stood alone in the small room in the early dark of the mountain evening, with the smell of wood smoke coming through the wall from the stove he must have lit, and she allowed herself precisely 30 seconds of whatever the feeling was that had been pressing against the inside of her chest all day. Not grief, exactly. Not relief. Something more complicated than either. She was 26 years old. She had traveled 800 miles for a future that had vanished in 30 seconds on a train platform. She was standing in a stranger's cabin on the side of a mountain in Colorado Territory with nothing but the contents of her trunk and a verbal agreement that was binding only by one man's stated commitment to his word. She had no idea if she'd made the right decision. What she did know, standing in that small room with the October wind outside and the smell of someone else's wood smoke coming through the walls, was that the particular cold she'd felt in Dunmore's Creek, that deep cold that had nothing to do with temperature, was already slightly less than it had been. She looked at the east-facing window. Tomorrow morning it would show her the mountains. She unpacked her coat and hung it back on the hook properly. There was work to do. Work, as it turned out, was the organizing principle of everything at Caleb Thorne's mountain homestead, and Eleanor threw herself into it with a focus that surprised even her. The first morning she was up before the light, by habit from the mill years, and she found the stove cold and Caleb already outside, and she built the fire herself and put water on and went looking for where he kept the coffee. She found the coffee. She made it strong, the way she'd made it every morning for years, and when Caleb came in from checking the livestock, he looked at the cup she handed him and said, "You were up early." "I don't sleep well in new places," she said. "Does it wear off?" "Eventually." He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. Outside, the mountain was doing the thing it apparently did every morning, which was go from black to gray to a particular shade of pale gold, the sky behind the eastern peaks going orange and pink before the sun cleared the ridge. "What are you most behind on?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her over his cup. "Most behind on?" "For winter. What's the most pressing?" He thought about it, setting down the cup. "Firewood's the first thing. I've got a cord cut, but I need 4 more cords at least. Timber's already down. I felled the trees in September. It just needs splitting and stacking." "What else?" "Chinked most of the cabin, but the north wall's got some gaps that need addressing before the hard cold comes. 2 fence posts in the lower pasture are rotted, need replacing before snow loads them. And I've got a batch of preserves I've been putting off." "Preserves," she repeated. My mother used to do them, he said, and something in his voice changed texture briefly and then went back to what it was. I've put up what I could, but I'm not efficient at it. Eleanor nodded. She filed away the moment with his mother. Didn't ask about it. I can do preserves. I worked in a kitchen for 2 years before the mill. What do you have to work with? He listed what was in the root cellar. It was a reasonable supply. Not generous, but enough to work with. She started going through it in her head, thinking about what order to preserve things in, what needed to be done before the temperature dropped further. I can split wood, she said. Caleb looked at her, and she recognized the look. It was the same look Jensen at the general store had given her, the same look Mrs. Putnam had given her, the look that said a woman doesn't do that. I know how to use a maul, Eleanor said. My uncle had a farm in Indiana. I split wood from the time I was 12 until I was 17 and went to work in the city. I'm not saying I'm as fast as you. I'm saying I can do it. He didn't argue with her. He also didn't immediately agree. Show me, he said. They went to the woodpile together, and he handed her the maul, a serious tool, 8 pounds of iron on a hickory handle, and Eleanor positioned a round of timber on the block, set her feet, and put it through clean in one swing. Caleb picked up the 2 halves, looked at the cut. All right, he said. They split wood for most of that first morning without talking very much. The rhythm of it was almost meditative. The position, the lift, the swing, the split, the reset. Her shoulders ached after the first hour, but it was a good ache, the kind that meant something useful was happening. Caleb worked beside her, and she was aware, without making anything of it, that he was watching her in the sideways manner of a person recalibrating an assumption. She didn't call attention to it. She just kept working. By noon, they had half a cord stacked. Not bad, Caleb said, which she was already understanding was his version of high praise. You said not bad? She asked. I said not bad. Is that good? It's not bad, he repeated, and there it was again, that thing that might be amusement if you looked at it in the right light. She ate her dinner. She had made a soup from the root vegetables in the cellar while the wood was drying in the morning, because she had come from a life where you didn't let a fire burn without something on it, and she went back to work in the afternoon. That evening, when the light failed and they came in for the night, she sat at the table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and cataloged the soreness in her muscles with the same businesslike attention she'd used to assess the homestead. She was going to hurt tomorrow, significantly. But the wood was stacked. The soup had been good. The north wall chinking was next. She had been here less than 48 hours, and she already understood something about this place. It didn't ask who you were before you came here. It only asked what you could do while you were here. That, she thought, looking out the window at the stars over the mountain, was something she could work with. 2 weeks into the mountain, Eleanor began to understand something that she hadn't expected. She had expected the work to be hard. It was hard. Every morning arrived with demands: wood, water, animals, food, repairs, and every evening left her with the kind of tiredness that dropped her into sleep before she'd finished thinking. But the hardness of it was straightforward, physical, comprehensible, the kind of hard that left something behind when it finished: a cord of wood, a sealed jar, a mended fence. What she hadn't expected was how it would feel to be in a place where being strong was simply useful. All her life, Eleanor's size had been something that other people felt the need to comment on. Too big for a girl, too rough, too much. Even the women at the mill, who were not exactly delicate themselves, had maintained a certain performance of femininity that Eleanor had always felt slightly outside of. She was good at the physical parts of things. She was stronger than most of the women she'd known and many of the men. And people had treated this not as an advantage, but as an oddity, something slightly off about her, a failure to be the right kind of woman. Here, she was just competent. Caleb Thorne watched her haul a 40-pound water barrel up from the creek one morning and didn't say anything about her being a woman doing a man's job. He said, "Knees bent more, less strain on your lower back." Then he went back to what he was doing. She adjusted her stance. Her lower back thanked her. She caught herself a few days later realizing that she'd gone several hours without thinking about Gerald Whitmore, without running the platform scene through her head again, without feeling the cold embarrassment of it. She'd been thinking about whether the root cellar temperature was stable enough for the winter squash she'd added the day before. She mentioned this to no one, but she noticed it. The goats learned her by the end of the first week, specifically the nanny, a cantankerous animal named by Caleb, apparently, contrary, who had strong opinions about her morning routine and communicated them loudly. Eleanor found that she had an unexpected talent for the goats. She was patient with them in a way she hadn't known she was patient, and patient with the chickens too, and with the horses, who she groomed each evening by lantern light while Caleb worked on gear repairs nearby, and they talked, or didn't, in about equal proportion. Talking was something she and Caleb did in pieces. He was not a social man. She could see that clearly. A man who had built 18 miles of mountain between himself and other people deliberately, who had organized his life around the kind of solitude that suited him. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just economical. He said things when he had something to say, and he said them directly, and he didn't perform warmth he didn't feel. She found this, somewhat to her surprise, restful. She had grown up around people who used conversation to fill silence, and who treated silence as something suspect. She had worked for years in the mill, where there was always noise and always commentary and always someone's opinion about something. She hadn't known how much of her energy had been spent on managing all of that until she was somewhere that didn't require it. One evening, toward the end of the second week, she came in from the barn later than usual. She'd been treating a small cut on one of the horse's fetlocks, and it had taken longer than expected, and found that Caleb had made dinner. Simple dinner, beans and salt pork, the kind of meal you made when you were feeding a body and not particularly trying to do more than that. He'd set a bowl at her place at the table. She sat down. She ate. After a while, she said, "Thank you." He said, "You were out late." "Figured." She looked at him across the table. "Do you ever wish you'd done this differently?" The arrangement. He seemed to think about the question with genuine care. "No," he said. "You're sure of that pretty quickly. You split 2 cords of wood in the first week," he said. "You put up 32 jars of preserves. You figured out that Contrary needed her pen shifted because the drainage was bad, and she was standing in mud, which was why she'd been off her milk." He looked at her without expression. "What would I wish was different?" Eleanor looked down at her beans. "The platform," she said, after a moment. "Did you see that?" The question sat there. The fire in the stove ticked. "Yes," Caleb said. She nodded. "And you came and found me anyway." "I found you because of it," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the table, not at her, but there was something in his face that was honest in the way only certain kinds of faces could be honest. Not performing honesty, not trying to say the right thing, just plain about the truth. "What do you mean? Man like Whitmore?" He stopped. Started again. What he did on that platform, that was about him needing a certain kind of woman, soft, small, something he could feel large next to. He picked up his spoon, set it down again. "I don't need that." Eleanor was quiet. "I need someone who can hold a line on the north side of a mountain when I can't be there," he said. "Someone who's not going to fall apart when it gets bad. It gets bad up here in winter. It gets—" He stopped. "You're not afraid of that. I could see it." "You saw all that in one afternoon?" "I saw you keep your dignity when a crowd of people were trying to take it," he said. "That's enough." The fire in the stove ticked. The wind outside had picked up since evening. She could hear it working at the corners of the cabin, the high-altitude wind that had a sound in it, unlike anything she'd known at lower elevation, something almost musical in its intensity. Eleanor looked at her bowl. She thought about all the things that had led her here: the advertisement, the letters, the train ticket, the platform, the 20 strangers laughing, the cold street corner where a man she didn't know had told her he'd paid a debt that wasn't his. "I haven't said thank you," she said. "For the debt. For Whitmore's bill. You don't need to." "I do, though." She looked at him. "It's not a small thing." He met her eyes briefly. "Consider it an investment," he said, "in the partnership. That's what you said on the street. It's still true." She picked up her spoon, finished her beans. The wind was louder now, pressing against the north wall where she'd re-chinked the gaps that week, and she was pleased to note that the cabin held no drafts, no whistling through, just the solid give and take of the structure absorbing what the mountain threw at it. She had done that. Those gaps were sealed because of her hands. "Same time tomorrow?" she said. "Same time," Caleb said. Outside, the October wind moved across the mountain, and the aspens shook their last gold leaves loose in the dark. And inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, And Eleanor Hart, 26 years old and 800 miles from everything she'd ever known, sat at a rough table with a cup of cooling coffee and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, like she was exactly where her particular set of qualities was required. Not perfect, not at ease, not certain of anything beyond the next morning's work, but real, present, useful, alive in a way that, until now, she hadn't known she wasn't. The third week on this mountain arrived with a sky the color of pewter and a wind that had changed its character overnight, colder now, with weight to it, the kind of wind that carried information about what was coming. Eleanor noticed it the moment she stepped outside that morning. She stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at the sky above the eastern ridge and felt the temperature against her face and thought, not yet, but soon. She'd grown up in Indiana long enough to know what a sky looked like when it was building towards something serious. Caleb came out behind her a few minutes later and stood beside her and looked at the same sky and said nothing for a long moment. "How long?" Eleanor asked. "Week, maybe," he said. "Could be less." She nodded and went back inside to finish her coffee standing at the stove, already thinking through the list of what wasn't done. The fence posts in the lower pasture. A section of the barn roof she'd noticed was soft when she'd climbed up to clear some debris. She hadn't said anything about it yet because she'd wanted to get closer to it before raising the alarm. And the firewood, which was now at 3 cords stacked and dry, was still a cord short of where she thought they needed to be. She set down her cup. "The barn roof," she said when Caleb came back in. "There's a section on the north side, maybe 4 feet across. It's soft." He looked at her. "I know about it." "You were going to say something?" "I was getting to it." "When?" "When I had the materials," he said, and there was a slight edge in it, the tone of a man who didn't enjoy being called to account on something he'd already identified. Eleanor recognized the edge and didn't push it further, but she filed it away. There was a pattern she was beginning to see in him, a particular kind of stubbornness about acknowledging limitations, the kind of stubbornness that developed in people who had operated alone long enough that asking for help felt uncomfortably close to admitting weakness. She had her own version of the same thing, if she was honest about it. "What do you need?" she asked. "Split shakes from the cedar pile. About 40. Takes half a day to split and another half to fit them properly." He sat down at the table. "I was going to do it this week." "Then let's do it today," Eleanor said, "before whatever that sky means actually happens." They worked on the barn roof through the morning and into the afternoon, Eleanor up on the slope of it with the cold wind working at her coat, while Caleb handed shakes up to her and she fitted them properly, tapping each one into place with the back of a hatchet. It was not comfortable work. The pitch of the roof was steep enough that she had to brace her feet carefully, and the split wood left splinters in her palms even through the cloth she'd wrapped around her hands. But she could see the problem clearly once she was up there. The rot had gone deeper than the surface. A section of the underlying board needed replacing too, and she called this down to Caleb, and they spent an extra hour dealing with it. When she finally climbed down, her shoulders aching and her hands stiff from the cold, Caleb looked up at the patch job and was quiet for a moment. "That's better than I would have done," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said, and she could see that he did. "You've got a good eye for fitting them flush." "I worked on my uncle's farmhouse every summer," she said. "He had a leaking roof for about 6 years. I fixed it twice." "Why twice?" "Because the first time I was 14 and I fixed it the way a 14-year-old fixes things." She picked a splinter out of her palm with her thumbnail. "The second time I was 16 and I did it right." Caleb almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a change in his face, but she was learning to read him and she caught it. "Come inside," he said. "Your hands look like you've been fighting the cedar and losing." She followed him in and sat at the table, and he brought her a basin of warm water without being asked, which she noticed, and she soaked her hands, and the feeling came back into them slowly, pins and needles first, and then something more ordinary. It was during this particular quiet, her hands in warm water, the stove clicking, the wind outside doing what the wind outside did, that she asked him the question she'd been turning over for most of the morning. "Why did you come back from the war and come here?" she said. "Specifically here, 18 miles up a mountain in Colorado Territory." He was at the stove with his back to her, and he didn't answer right away. "You don't have to tell me," she added. "I know I don't." He poured himself coffee, didn't turn around yet. "It's just—" He stopped. Not a short answer. I'm not going anywhere tonight. He turned then and sat down across from her, and he looked at his coffee, and she waited, because she'd learned that Caleb Thorne arrived at things in his own time, and pushing only made him close up. I grew up in Ohio, he said finally. Farming family. Went into the war at 19. Came back at 22. He looked at his hands around the cup. The places I knew, the town, the people. They wanted you to be the same person you were when you left. They wanted the war to be something you put away like a coat you wore once. And I couldn't do that. And after about a year of trying to do that and failing at it, I understood that I needed to go somewhere that didn't know what I was before. Somewhere that only saw what I was now. Eleanor looked at him, and this was that place. I got as far as Dunmore's Creek before the money ran short, and I worked a season for a rancher and saved enough to buy the land up here. He paused. First winter I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Too cold. Too isolated. I got sick in February, and there was nobody to know. I nearly... He stopped. It was a bad winter. But you stayed. Spring came, he said. It always does. He said it like a man who had needed that fact to be true many times and had found that it reliably was, which was different from saying it like a platitude. Second year was better. By the third year I understood why I'd come here. The mountain doesn't ask you questions about who you used to be. It asks you whether you can do the work in front of you. That's what you saw in me, Eleanor said slowly. It wasn't a question. He met her eyes briefly. You were trying to solve a problem, practically, right there in the street. Most people in that situation, he paused. Most people would have been looking for someone to rescue them. I was looking for a solution, she said. There's a difference. Yes, he said. There is. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the newly patched barn, and the patch held, and the stove kept the room at the temperature of something habitable, and Eleanor took her hands out of the basin and dried them on the cloth he'd left, and looked at her palms where the splinters had been, the small dotted marks already starting to close. She thought about Ohio and a man who came back from a war and couldn't fit himself back into the shape people expected of him. She thought about Cincinnati and a woman who couldn't fit herself into the shape people expected of her either, for entirely different reasons. She thought about the strange arithmetic of two people who had both been told, in different ways, that they were the wrong size for the space they occupied, and how those two wrong sizes could end up fitting together in a mountain cabin in Colorado territory like they'd been measured for it. She didn't say any of that out loud. Some thoughts were only useful to think. I should check on Contrary, she said instead. She was fine an hour ago. She's always fine an hour ago. It's the current hour I worry about with that animal. Caleb made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh this time, short and caught off guard, and Eleanor got up and put on her coat and went out to check on the goat, who was, predictably, in the process of attempting to disassemble part of her pen's gate for reasons known only to herself. Eleanor fixed the gate. The goat regarded her with yellow-eyed contempt. We understand each other, Eleanor told her, and went back inside. The next 2 days were ordinary ones, if ordinary was the right word for days that began before dawn and ended past dark, and involved the steady, absorbing labor of a homestead tightening itself against an approaching season. Eleanor found that ordinary was, in fact, the right word, because ordinary was exactly what these days felt like, in a way that still surprised her when she noticed it. She had been here less than a month, and already the shape of a day here felt more natural to her than 5 years of mill mornings had ever felt. On the fourth day, the storm hit. It announced itself honestly, at least. The sky had been building toward it for 2 days, getting lower and grayer and heavier, and the temperature had been dropping since Tuesday morning in the slow, deliberate way that suggested something serious rather than a passing cold snap. By Wednesday evening, the wind had gone quiet in the way that winds sometimes did before they turned violent, and Caleb had spent the better part of the day doing a final round of preparations. Extra hay brought in from the field stack, the animals moved to the barn, the water barrels filled to the rim and covered. Eleanor had been right beside him for all of it, and if he'd been the type to waste time wondering whether she'd keep up, he'd stopped wondering somewhere around the second week. They brought the pack mule in last. He was a substantial animal named nothing in particular. Caleb simply called him the mule, which the mule seemed to accept as a reasonable arrangement. And he had been packed that day for a planned trip down the mountain to the trade post, a trip that was now obviously not happening. The packs were still loaded. "We should get those off him," Eleanor said. "I'll do it in the morning," Caleb said. "Let him settle tonight. He's been worked." She didn't argue with it. The mule was in the barn, and the barn was solid, and the packs, while heavy, were his to deal with. She went inside and made dinner, and by the time the sun went down, or the point in the sky where the sun presumably was, behind about 4 layers of cloud, the first snow had started, small and fine and steady, the kind that committed. By midnight, it had committed considerably more. Eleanor woke at what she guessed was 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind having returned from wherever it had gone, and it was not the same wind. This was a different animal entirely, full-throated and directional, driving the snow sideways against the north wall of the cabin with a sound like gravel. She lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about the barn and the animals and the packed mule and felt uneasy in a way she couldn't quite articulate until she could. The trail to the creek, the part of the trail that ran along the edge of a ravine drop, maybe 60 feet of exposed path where the ground fell sharply away on the east side. In ordinary conditions, it was nothing. Wide enough, clear enough, no particular hazard. But if the mule got loose in this wind, in this dark, if something spooked him and he wasn't packed down, she got up. She dressed in the dark, all of it, 2 pairs of wool stockings, her heaviest trousers under the skirt she wore for modesty's sake, and then immediately pushed up and belted out of the way she'd been doing for weeks because the skirt was useless for work, her flannel shirt, her heaviest wool coat. She tied her boots and wrapped a scarf around her head and face and opened the cabin door, and the storm came in. The cold was different from cold. It was a physical force, coherent and aggressive, hitting her in the chest and face the moment she stepped out. The snow was coming in at an angle, near horizontal, and the lantern she'd lit the moment she'd thought of going out guttered immediately and then caught and threw a circle of yellow light approximately 2 feet in diameter, which was not a great deal of light. She put her head down and walked toward the barn. The world had been reduced to what was directly in front of her feet. The snow was already 4 inches deep, maybe more, drifted against the cabin wall in soft shapes that looked almost gentle and were not. She kept one hand on the line they'd strung between the cabin and the barn for exactly this purpose. Caleb had installed it her second week there, showing it to her with the matter-of-fact tone of someone cataloging necessary infrastructure, and she had thought at the time that the kind of person who put up a safety line before the season arrived was the kind of person worth paying attention to. She pulled the barn door open against the drift that had already accumulated at its base and got inside. The animals were agitated. She could feel it before her eyes adjusted, the particular quality of sound from animals that were nervous, the horses shifting and snorting, the goats pressed against the far wall in a cluster. The mule was at the back of the barn, and he was the worst of them, moving in his stall with a restless energy that she recognized as the precursor to something worse. She went to him first. He was still packed as Caleb had left him. The full winter supply packs, provisions and tools, and a cast iron pot, and 2 months of traded goods, and everything else they'd been planning to bring down to the post and restock from. The total weight across his back was, she estimated, close to 200 pounds. He was a big mule and he could carry it, but what she was looking at now was an animal that was genuinely frightened in an enclosed space with 200 pounds on his back, and frightened large animals with heavy loads did unpredictable things. She set down the lantern in a safe corner and talked to him, low and steady, the way she talked to Contrary when the goat was working up to something destructive. She put her hands on his neck and felt the muscles under his coat, rigid and vibrating with something between fear and the building impulse to move. "Easy," she said. I know. It's loud. It's just wind." The barn groaned in a gust, and he shifted against her hands, and she braced. Then the barn door opened behind her. Caleb was there, in his coat and hat, the snow coming in around him for a moment before he got the door shut. He took in the barn in one sweep. Her hands on the mule, the packed bags, the animal's agitation. "I thought you were asleep," he said. "I thought you were too. What woke you?" The wind shifted. "I thought about the ravine trail." She kept her hands on the mule's neck. "He needs to be unpacked. If he bolts—" "I know." He was already moving, coming to the mule's other side, getting to the pack straps. "I should have done this last night. You were tired." "Still should have." They worked together in the lantern light while the storm did what it was doing outside. Caleb on one side of the mule, Eleanor on the other, getting the straps loose without spooking him further, keeping the conversation going between them and with the animal in the even, purposeful tones of people who were focused on the problem in front of them. The mule was difficult. He kept shifting, kept pulling against the loosening weight in a way that made each strap take twice as long as it should have. Eleanor got a knee in the shoulder from him at one point that she would feel for a week, and she said a word under her breath that she wouldn't have said at the boarding house, and Caleb didn't comment on it. They got the first pack off. Eleanor grabbed it and swung it to the wall and was turning back when a second gust hit the barn, harder than the ones before. A big, mean gust that hit the structure broadside and flexed the walls and made a sound like something giving way. And the mule moved, not a bolt. A sudden sideways lunge, the way a large, frightened animal moves when it's trying to get away from something and doesn't have the space to run. A violent sideways shift of 2/3 of a ton of panicked mule, the second pack still attached and swinging loose, and Caleb was between the mule and the wall and didn't have room to move, and Eleanor was at the mule's head. She grabbed the halter, both hands, full grip, planting her feet in the hay and the dirt underneath the hay, putting everything she had into the opposite direction from where the mule was going. And she was aware in some distant part of her mind that this was a test of something very basic and concrete, whether she was strong enough to matter right now, in this barn, in this storm, with this animal. She was not stronger than the mule. Nobody was. But she was strong enough to change the geometry of it slightly, strong enough to pull the head sideways and down in a way that horses and mules couldn't fight completely. An instinctive response to having their head controlled that overrode some of the panic, and Caleb got clear of the wall and then was at the mule's side with both hands and his weight against the animal's shoulder, and together they got the thing to stop moving. For a moment, it was just the three of them standing in the barn with the storm outside and Eleanor's arms shaking with the effort of the grip and the mule breathing hard against her hands. "You all right?" Caleb said, across the mule's back. "Yes." Her voice was steady. She was pleased about that. "You?" "Fine." He was not entirely fine. She could see a scrape on the back of his hand where the wall had caught him, bleeding a little. He looked at it briefly and apparently decided it was beneath consideration. "Hold him while I get the second pack." She held the mule. He got the pack. The barn settled. They stood the mule in the middle of the barn, away from the walls, and Eleanor kept a hand on him while Caleb redistributed the packs to a safe corner and checked on the other animals one by one. Horses first, then goats, then the chickens in their corner who were apparently operating on the theory that if they couldn't see the storm, it wasn't happening. Everything was where it should be. The barn held. The roof she'd patched 3 days ago held with it. Caleb came back to stand beside her at the mule. "The pack has the iron pod in it," he said. "I know. It was swinging loose when he lurched." She let out a breath. "If he'd gone for the door, he'd have made the ravine trail in the dark in a blizzard with 200 pounds on his back." "Yes." The words sat there between them. If the mule had gone through the door and hit that trail and gone over, and in that condition, in that wind, in that dark, he would have gone over. They would have lost the better part of their winter supply. Not all of it, but enough of it that the arithmetic of the season would have changed fundamentally. Caleb looked at her across the settled animal. "I wouldn't have hurt him," he said. "Not in that." "I don't know that I would have hurt him either if I'd stayed in bed another 10 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. "What made you get up?" She thought about it. "Unease," she said. "I couldn't put a name to it for a minute. Then I could." He nodded, slowly, like a man receiving information he was going to think about. They stayed in the barn for another hour, because the storm was still going hard, and because they were already there, and because the animals were calmer with people present. Eleanor sat on a hay bale at some point, and Caleb sat on the one beside her, and they listened to the storm work itself through in the lantern light, the big gusts and the quieter moments between them, and the steady underscore of the snow finding every gap in every board. "When I came out west," Caleb said, at some point during the quieter stretch, "I thought the hardest thing was going to be the solitude." "Was it?" "No," he said. "The hardest thing was learning to trust my own judgment again." He was looking at the animals, not at her. "In the war, your judgment got you and other people killed or didn't. That stays with you. You start second-guessing everything because everything went wrong so many times. And when you're alone up here and something goes wrong, you've got nobody to second-guess along with you. It's just you and what you decided. She thought about that. But you're still here, she said. Your judgment's been working. Mostly. He paused. Tonight I should have unpacked the mule. You were tired. You made a judgment call. It almost went wrong and it didn't. She looked at him. That's most of what life is. He looked back at her finally. In the lantern light, his face was different than it was in daylight. The shadows did something to it, made it less closed, or maybe she was just getting better at reading it. You're not what I expected, he said. People keep saying that to me, Eleanor said. I've yet to decide if it's a compliment. It is, he said, simply and without decoration. She looked at the mule, who had fallen asleep on his feet the way horses and mules could do, apparently having decided that the crisis was resolved and there was no reason not to return to unconsciousness. Get some sleep, Caleb said. I'll sit with them a bit longer. I'll stay. You don't have to. I know. She shifted on the hay bale and got comfortable, relative to what comfortable meant on a hay bale in a barn in a blizzard. But I'm already here and the bed is cold by now anyway. He accepted this with a slight nod, and they sat side by side in the hay with the storm easing off outside. Finally, the gusts spacing further apart and the sound of it dropping from a roar to a steady hiss of snow on wood. The lantern between them threw its yellow circle, and the animals breathed and the barn held, and somewhere around 4 a.m, Eleanor fell asleep sitting upright on the hay bale, which was not comfortable, and which she did not, for a few hours, notice at all. She woke to gray light coming through the barn's gaps, and the sounds of the mountain after a storm, a deep, pressed-down quiet that was the opposite of silence, full of the weight of new snow on everything. Her neck ached. Her back ached. The hay bale had, in the night, made its opinion of her presence known to approximately every part of her that had been in contact with it. Caleb was awake. She could hear him at the far end of the barn doing the morning check on the animals. She got up, slowly, and stretched the way you stretched when you were 26 and had slept in a barn, and went to help him. He looked at her when she came down the length of the barn. She looked like what she was, a woman who had slept in her coat in a barn and had the hay to prove it. Morning, she said. Morning. He handed her the goat's feed pail without further comment on her appearance, because commenting on it would have changed nothing, and he was a man who understood what changed things and what didn't. She fed the goats. Contrary ate with her usual contemptuous efficiency. Outside, the world had been covered over and made new. The snow had come in at nearly a foot in the open yard and deeper in the drifts, and the peaks above the cabin were white all the way down to a line that was noticeably lower than it had been yesterday morning. The creek would be running higher than usual. The lower trail would be a different proposition than it was last week. Eleanor stood on the porch after the morning chores and looked at all of it. The white yard, the white trees, the white mountains stacked above each other into a sky that had gone clear and pale blue in the way that skies went after a storm had wrung them out. She had lived in this place for less than a month. She had arrived here from a train platform where a crowd of strangers had laughed at her, with nothing but a trunk and 3 nights of board and the offer of a man she'd never met, because the alternatives were worse. She had expected to be surviving. She had expected to be grinding through it, finding a way to make it work through sheer stubbornness, because stubborn was what she had. She had not expected to feel, standing in a foot of new snow on the morning after a blizzard, something that was remarkably close to belonging. She heard Caleb come out behind her. Fence line will need checking after the storm, she said, and the creek trail, and I want to look at the roof again. I know. He stood beside her on the porch. His hand, she noticed, had a strip of clean cloth wrapped around where the wall had scraped him. He dealt with it at some point. List is longer than a day, she said. It always is. They stood there for a moment, looking at the white world. The mule was in the barn behind them, alive and intact, along with everything on his back. The barn roof was holding. The cabin was warm. There was food in the root cellar and wood in the stack. Eleanor picked up the axe leaning against the porch rail. Lower pasture fence first, she said. She stepped off the porch into the snow. The weeks after the blizzard settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had not anticipated and would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. The mountain in deep November was a different creature from the mountain in October, quieter in some ways, louder in others. the snow muffling the sounds of the lower country while amplifying the sounds directly overhead, the wind in the high timber, the crack of branches under ice load, the particular percussion of snow sliding off the barn roof in the mid-morning when the sun hit it. She and Caleb moved through their days with the efficiency of people who had worked out, without much discussion, how to occupy the same space without collision. He took the far pasture and the timber work and the heavier repairs. She took the barn in the mornings, the preserving and the cooking, and the kind of maintenance work that required patience more than brute force, restitching the harness leather that had started to crack, patching the wool blankets, keeping the accounts that Caleb kept in his head and had never written down, which she had started keeping in a small ledger she'd found blank among his supplies because numbers floating in one man's memory were a liability when that man could get hurt. He had looked at the ledger when she put it on the table the first evening, open to her careful columns. "I know what we have," he said. "Now I know too," she said. "And if something happens to you, so does whoever comes after." He had looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she'd come to recognize as him revising an assumption. Then he'd sat down and gone through the figures with her, correcting 2 things she'd gotten wrong from his verbal account and adding a third she hadn't known about. A small debt to the trade post that he'd apparently been servicing in goods rather than cash. "Why didn't you mention that?" she asked. "It's minor. It goes in the ledger whether it's minor or not." He let her put it in the ledger. December came down the mountain the way December came down mountains, without apology. The temperatures at night were dropping past anything Eleanor had experienced in Indiana or Ohio, the kind of cold that made the cabin walls contract and pop in the dark hours, and that turned the water in the basin to a skim of ice by morning if the fire had died down overnight. They took turns banking the stove before sleep, a nightly task that Eleanor had absorbed into her own routine without discussion, because she was usually awake later than him, her mind running through the next day's list while he was already asleep in his corner of the main room. She had offered him back his bedroom more than once. He had declined more than once. After the 3rd time, she stopped offering, because it was starting to feel like an argument neither of them was having out loud about something neither of them was ready to name. She was aware by December of several things she had not been aware of in October. She was aware that Caleb Thorne was, beneath the economy of his manner, a careful and decent man, not in the showy way of men who wanted credit for their decency, but in the structural way of someone for whom fairness was simply how he was built. He had said what he meant on a street corner in Dunmore's Creek, and he had continued to mean it, which was rarer than it should have been. He had never once, in 6 weeks of close quarters and hard work and occasional disagreement, made her feel like a charity case, or a subordinate, or less than what the partnership agreement said she was. She was also aware, and this was the part she spent less time looking at directly, that she had stopped thinking of him as a stranger somewhere around the 3rd week and had started thinking of him as... She didn't have a clean word for it. The closest she could get was known. He was known to her, and she believed she was known to him, in the specific way that people became known to each other when they worked beside each other through hard things, without pretending the hard things weren't hard. That was enough to think about for now. She had learned in her life not to build too far ahead of her foundations. The day the letter arrived, the weather had briefly relented into something almost mild. A December thaw, Caleb called it. A few days where the temperature came up enough to make the snow on the south slopes weep in thin streams and the trail down to Dunmore's Creek briefly manageable. Caleb had taken the mule down to the trade post for a resupply run, the trip they'd postponed since the blizzard, leaving before dawn with a list Eleanor had written out for him in the order of priority, most critical at the top in case the pack weight became an issue. She spent the day alone on the homestead, which she had not been since she arrived, and she found that she did not mind it in the way she might have expected to. There was enough to do. There was always enough to do. She spent the morning on the harness repair she'd been nursing along, the afternoon hauling and stacking the split wood from the pile Caleb had been working through all week, and by the time the light started going orange, she had a good fire and a pot of beans on the stove, and was sitting at the table with the ledger, going through the numbers for the 3rd time, because the 3rd time she found things she'd missed on the first 2. She heard the mule on the trail before she heard Caleb, the particular irregular rhythm of a loaded animal navigating the lower switchback, and she put the ledger aside and started getting the barn ready in her mind. Unloading sequence, where the new supplies would go, what needed to be checked against the list. Caleb came through the door an hour later looking like a man who had ridden 18 miles in December and had something on his mind that the 18 miles hadn't resolved. She looked at him. He set the saddlebag on the table and then set a letter on top of it. The letter had been opened, she could see. Not by him. The envelope was torn in the messy way of official handling, not the careful way of a person opening correspondence that wasn't theirs. There was a seal on the outside that she didn't recognize. "This came for you at the post," he said. They'd been holding it since October. Ryder brought it up from Denver. Eleanor looked at the letter. Then she picked it up. The return address was a legal firm in Cincinnati, a name she didn't recognize, 2 surnames hyphenated in the style of established firms. She turned the envelope over. Her name on the front, and below it, care of Dunmore's Creek General Post, Colorado Territory, which meant someone had known approximately where she was going when they sent it, which meant it had been sent before the platform, before Whitmore, when she was still in Cincinnati and the future had still looked like what she thought it was going to be. She pulled out the letter. It was 3 pages. Legal language, the kind of dense formal prose that lawyers use to say simple things in complicated ways so that you needed them to translate it for you. Eleanor read slowly, parsing it, going back to sentences that didn't resolve the first time. Caleb sat across from her and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated. She read it through once. Then she sat with it for a moment. Then she read the 3rd page again, because the 3rd page had the numbers on it, and she had thought she'd misread them. She had not misread them. "My mother's brother," she said, finally. Caleb waited. "He died in August. I didn't know him well. He went west when I was a child. I don't think I saw him more than twice. He never married. He had no children." She set the letter down on the table. "He had land, a parcel outside of Denver, 60 acres, and he'd bought it in 72 when land was cheap out here." She stopped. "It's not cheap anymore." "How much land?" 60 acres, but the value—" She looked at the letter again. "There's a rail line being surveyed. According to this, the parcel sits directly in the proposed path. The attorneys say the land value has increased." She found the figure, said it. The number sat in the room between them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her face, she realized, reading it with the same careful attention she used on his. "You're the sole heir," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly read that much from her expression. "Apparently, his estate has been through probate since September. They've been trying to locate me since October." She thought about the letter she'd left with Mrs. Putnam, the aunt in Pittsburgh she'd written to before leaving with Caleb, the forwarding address she'd given as Dunmore's Creek because she hadn't had anything better to give. Someone connected the address. "Does anyone else know about this?" Caleb asked. She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "The post in Dunmore's Creek," he said. He said it carefully, in the tone of a man who had already thought about this and had not liked where the thinking went. "The postmaster talks, I told you that." She looked at the letter, the opened envelope, the seal that had been broken before the letter reached her. "You think someone read it," she said. "I think it's possible." "Who would—" She stopped. The answer arrived without being called. Gerald Whitmore, who owned one of the 2 general stores in Dunmore's Creek, which meant he had ongoing business with the trade post, which meant he had relationships with the people there. Gerald Whitmore, who had looked at her on that platform with the specific contempt of a man who felt cheated of something. Gerald Whitmore, who had tried to use a debt to keep her tethered to a town she'd already left. "He doesn't know where I am," she said. "He knows you left with me," Caleb said, "and he knows where I live. This valley is not a secret." She looked at him across the table. The fire in the stove was doing what it did, and the beans were doing what they were doing, and outside the brief December warmth was already ending, the temperature falling again as the sun went down, and none of that mattered at this particular moment. "How long would it take someone from Dunmore's Creek to put something together?" she said. "If they had a figure like that, and they thought they had a claim—" "No legitimate claim," Caleb said. "You're the heir. It's legal." "Legal and what someone does aren't always the same thing." He held her gaze. "No," he said, "they're not." She thought about the mountain between here and Dunmore's Creek. 18 miles. In deep winter, a serious undertaking. In a thaw like the one they were currently in, manageable. 3 or 4 days, maybe less with purpose behind you. "I should write to the attorneys," she said. Establish the correspondence. Get the formal documentation started. Yes. And we should... She stopped. She was about to say we should be careful, and then she sat with what that meant, concretely, on a mountain homestead in December. What careful looked like when the thing you were being careful about was people who might want something badly enough to come and take it. I have a rifle, Caleb said. You know where it is? I know where it is. You know how to use it. My uncle had a farm, she said, which by now they both understood to be the answer to many questions. He nodded. Then we deal with the practical things first. Letter to the attorneys. Keep the ledger locked. I have a box with a lock on it, under the floorboard in the main room. He paused. And we don't talk about this to anyone who comes up from the valley. Has anyone come up since I arrived? One trapper in November, nobody else. People will come, she said, if the trail's passable. Yes, he said. People will come. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it in her hands for a moment. 60 acres outside Denver. A rail survey. Numbers that would have seemed fictional to her a month ago. Numbers that would have seemed fictional to her on the platform in Dunmore's Creek when 20 strangers were laughing at the woman who was too large and too rough to be a merchant's wife. She thought about what it meant, not abstractly, concretely. What it meant for the partnership. What it meant for the winter. What it meant for the spring that Caleb had said always came. This doesn't change the partnership, she said. He looked at her. I mean that, she said. The land is mine by inheritance, and it has nothing to do with what we've built here. I'm not leaving in the spring with a fortune and waving goodbye. That's not... She stopped, finding the right words. That's not who I am. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't ask you about that. I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because you paid a debt on a street corner for a woman you'd never met because you thought she was worth the investment. I think you deserve to know that the investment is still standing. Something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely name. Something that went deeper than the controlled expression he usually kept. It was there, and then it was put away. Not hidden exactly, but set aside. The way you set aside something you needed to think about when you had the space for it. Write the letter, he said. I'll find the lockbox. She wrote the letter that evening, at the table, by the lantern, in the formal but plain prose she'd developed over years of mill correspondence and practical communication. She told the attorneys she had received their letter, confirmed her identity, provided the Dunmore's Creek address as a contact point, and requested that all documents be held pending her ability to travel to Denver in spring. She did not mention Caleb or the homestead, or anything about her current circumstances. She sealed it and addressed it, and Caleb put it in his coat for the next trip down. She put the original letter in the lockbox. The lockbox went under the floor. They ate dinner late that night, the beans she'd made and some of the dried elk that Caleb had brought back from the trade post. And the conversation was quieter than usual, both of them sitting with the implications of the afternoon. The fire burned, and the wind outside was picking up again, the thaw ending, the cold reasserting itself in the way it did up here. Not gradually, but definitively, as if the brief warmth had been a mistake the mountain was correcting. Tell me about the parcel, Caleb said after a while. What you know about it? She told him what the letter contained. The location, the acreage, the railroad survey, the projected value. He listened with the focused attention he gave to anything that had practical implications, asking 2 or 3 specific questions about the survey route and the timeline that surprised her with their precision. You know about railroad land, she said. I know people who had it and people who lost it, he said. The survey's only a proposal right now. It becomes real when they break ground, and that can take years. The value in the letter is projection, not certainty. You think it's less than they say? I think it's uncertain, he said carefully, which is different from less. The land itself is real. 60 acres outside Denver is real, regardless of the railroad. He looked at the table. What matters is that someone who knew about it might think it's more certain than it is, might act on that assumption. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, who she knew to be a man who acted on assumptions, who had assumed she would be a certain kind of woman, who had assumed she would be destroyed by public humiliation, who had assumed that a debt could be used to contain her. He had been wrong on all counts. She was beginning to suspect that being wrong would not make him less dangerous. Some men, when they were wrong, learned from it. Other men, when they were wrong, got angry. She had a clear enough picture of Gerald Whitmore, from 6 letters and one devastating platform encounter, to have a strong sense of which kind he was. "I want to learn the rifle better," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You know how to shoot." "I know how to shoot at a range I practiced at 10 years ago. I want to be current." She met his eyes. "Will you work with me?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Starting when the weather allows." "Starting when the weather allows." She put her hand on the table, palm down, not reaching for his, just resting there, an unconscious gesture. "We're going to be all right," she said. It wasn't reassurance, not exactly. It was more like an assessment. The way she'd said all right in the barn during the blizzard, not as comfort, but as evaluation. Caleb put his hand flat on the table too, a few inches from hers. Not touching, just there, solid and present. "I expect so," he said. The days between that conversation and the day the first rider came were 12. She knew it was 12 because she had been keeping a daily tally in the ledger, a habit she'd started as a child in Indiana when her mother was sick the second time, and Eleanor had needed to organize her sense of time against the anxiety of not knowing how things were going to go. She had kept tallies during the bad years at the mill, too, marking off days toward some unnamed thing that she'd hoped was coming but couldn't name. Here, the tally was simply documentary, a record of what had been done each day, how many cords of wood remained, what the temperature had been, what the animals had needed. A ledger of the actual life. 12 days after the letter arrived, she was at the far end of the upper pasture when she heard the horse on the trail below. She had been checking the fence line on the north boundary, a task she'd taken on that morning because Caleb was working in the timber above the cabin, and she'd wanted the space of physical work and open air. The upper pasture gave her a clear line of sight down the switchback approach to the homestead, which was one of the things she appreciated about it, though she had not until recently thought of that appreciation as related to anything other than the view. One rider, moving steadily, not hurried. A workhorse, not a road horse. She watched from the fence line as the rider came around the last switchback and into the lower clearing and stopped in the yard. She did not recognize the man. He was perhaps 50, weathered and heavy-set, in a sheepskin coat that had been expensive once. He sat on his horse in the yard and looked at the cabin and looked around the property with the specific attention of a man who was not lost and was taking stock of what he'd found. Eleanor walked back down toward the yard. She had the hatchet on her belt. She always had the hatchet on her belt for the fence work. It was a practical tool, not a weapon, but it was there, and she was aware of it being there. The rifle was in the cabin. Caleb was in the timber, possibly within shouting distance, possibly not. She walked down the slope in the open so that the rider saw her coming. She had learned in her life that surprises rarely went well, and she would rather be seen approaching than appear suddenly from a direction that made a stranger's hand go to a gun. The rider turned toward her when she was 40 feet out. He looked at her the way people looked at people they'd been given a description of and were checking against the reality. "You Eleanor Hart?" he said. "I am," she said. She stopped at a distance that felt like conversation rather than confrontation, and she looked at him the way she looked at everything that needed to be understood. "And you are?" "Name's Arden. I work for Mr. Whitmore." She said nothing. She waited. "Mr. Whitmore sent me up to deliver a message," the man said. He reached into his coat with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that reaching into your coat around a stranger required announcement. He produced an envelope. "And to wait for a reply." She looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "What kind of message requires you to ride 18 miles in December?" "The important kind," Arden said. He had the flat, expressionless delivery of a hired man who was reciting something told to him rather than saying something he believed. "Mr. Whitmore has come into some information about your family, about property that belongs to you." A pause. "He wants to discuss a business arrangement." Eleanor's chest went very still. "What kind of business arrangement?" "He'll explain that in the letter." Arden held it out again. This time she walked to him and took it. She did not open it. "Mr. Whitmore says he has contacts in Denver, people in the land office. He says he can help expedite the estate process, make sure the right people know about the claim before the wrong people do." Another pause. He says you'd want to know that there are parties in Denver already interested in that land. He says he can help you handle them. Eleanor held the envelope. She looked at the man on the horse. He was not a cruel man, she thought. He was just a man who worked for one and had been given a task. He had the look of someone who did what he was paid to do without examining it closely, which was its own kind of moral failure, but a different kind than Whitmore's. "Tell Mr. Whitmore," she said, "that I received his message, and that I'll give him an answer in my own time." Arden nodded. "He was hoping for something today." "I expect he was," Eleanor said. "He can keep hoping." There was a moment, a brief moment, where Arden's expression shifted into something that was not the flat hired man expression, something that had more in it, and she catalogued it without reacting to it. "Miss Hart," he said, "you should know, Mr. Whitmore isn't—" He stopped. The flat expression came back. "I'll tell him what you said." He turned his horse and rode back down the trail. Eleanor stood in the yard and watched him go all the way to the first switchback before she moved. Then she turned and looked toward the timber above the cabin. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled sharp and clear, the way her uncle had taught her to call dogs across a field, and she waited. After a minute, she heard the sound of Caleb coming down through the timber, moving fast enough that she knew he'd heard the horse earlier and had been on his way back already. He came into the yard and she handed him the letter without a word. He read it standing in the cold, and she watched his face do what it did. That process of internal reckoning she'd come to recognize, steady on the surface and working underneath. He finished reading, looked up. "He's offering to act as an intermediary," he said, "between you and the Denver buyers, for a percentage." "A large percentage." "Yes. He doesn't have any contacts in the land office," Eleanor said. "He's a merchant in a frontier town. That's a bluff?" "Probably." Caleb folded the letter. "The part about interested parties in Denver is probably not a bluff. That land gets more real every week the railroad survey progresses. There will be buyers." "He's trying to put himself between me and what's mine," Eleanor said. "Yes." "Because he thinks I don't know what I'm doing." Caleb looked at her. He said nothing because nothing needed to be said about that. She took the letter back from him and looked at it again. Gerald Whitmore's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had written many business letters and knew how to make them sound reasonable. "I want only to help. I have your best interests at heart. These are complicated matters for a woman alone." "A woman alone?" She folded the letter, put it in her coat. "He thinks you're alone," Caleb said. He said it quietly, not as a comfort, but as an observation, as information. "He does," Eleanor agreed. She looked at the trail where Arden had gone, already around the switchback and out of sight, carrying her non-answer back down the mountain to the man who had sent him. Let him think what he thought. Let him build whatever he was building on the assumption that she was a woman alone on a mountain with an inheritance she didn't know how to protect and nowhere to turn. He had been wrong about her before. He would be wrong about her again. She went inside and put Whitmore's letter in the lockbox next to the letter from the attorneys, and she took out the ledger and opened it to that day's page and wrote the date at the top. And below it, "Writer came. Whitmore knows. Need to be ready." Then she put a number at the bottom and drew a line under it, the way she marked the end of a column that was ready to be summed. Caleb came in behind her and looked at the ledger over her shoulder. "What's that number?" he said. "Days until the trail is good enough for multiple riders," she said. "If the thaw holds." He looked at it. He didn't argue with her math. She closed the ledger. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, the mountain reasserting its winter, and somewhere 18 miles below them, in a tidy office above a general store, a man with a careful handwriting and a great deal of misplaced confidence was waiting for an answer that was never going to be the one he expected. The number Eleanor had written in the ledger turned out to be wrong by 4 days. She had calculated based on the trail condition and the weather pattern, and the reasonable assumption that a man like Whitmore would need time to put something together. Time to hire, time to plan, time to convince himself that what he was doing was justified rather than what it actually was. She had given him more credit than he deserved. Either that, or he had started putting it together before Arden ever rode up the mountain, which meant the letter had not been a business proposition at all, but a last courtesy extended to someone he'd already decided to take from. She found out which one it was later. At the time, what she knew was that she woke 4 days earlier than she'd expected to the sound of horses on the lower trail, multiple horses, and the particular quality of pre-dawn dark that said it was still 2 hours before light. She was dressed and at the window in under a minute, which told her something about the state of her sleep in the weeks since Arden's visit. She had not been sleeping deeply. She had been sleeping the way people slept when they were waiting for something. The window faced east and the trail came from the west, and she couldn't see them yet, but she could hear them. 3 horses, she thought, maybe 4, moving with the careful pace of riders who were trying to be quieter than they were. There was a rhythm to horses being ridden quietly that was different from horses moving at their natural gait, a deliberate suppression of sound that actually made them easier to identify once you knew what you were listening for. She went to the main room. Caleb was already up. He was at the opposite window, the one that faced the approach, and he had the rifle. He had pulled on his boots and coat over his sleeping clothes, and he had the rifle and he was looking out the gap at the side of the shutter with the focused stillness of a man who had done this kind of waiting before, in worse places and for higher stakes, and had learned what it cost to move too early. "How many?" she said quietly. 4 riders, stopped at the edge of the clearing. He didn't look at her. "Get the axe." She got the axe from beside the door where she kept it, and she also took the long-handled wood maul from the corner and set it within reach, because she believed in having more than one option. Then she stood to the side of the door, not in front of it, to the side, and waited in the dark while the fire in the stove ticked its ordinary tick and the clock on the shelf said it was not yet 4 in the morning. A voice came from outside, loud enough to carry, controlled enough to be deliberate. "Thorn, we know you're in there. Come out." Caleb didn't move from the window. He said loud enough to carry back, "I'm in here. Tell me what you want from out there." A pause. Some shuffling movement from the direction of the clearing, the sound of horses and men redistributing. "We're here for the woman," the voice said. "Eleanor Hart. She's to come with us back to Dunmore's Creek. No trouble needs to happen." Eleanor felt something clarify in her chest. Not calm, exactly, but clarity, which was a different thing. The specific focus that arrived when a situation moved from possibility to fact. "What's the charge?" Caleb called back. "No charge. She's wanted for a legal matter. Property dispute. The marshal's involved." Caleb looked at Eleanor across the dark room. She shook her head once, firmly. There was no property dispute. There was no legitimate legal matter. There was Gerald Whitmore and 4 hired men at 4 in the morning, and the only reason anyone arrived before dawn was because dawn was when defenses were lowest and confusion was highest. "The marshal can come up himself," Caleb said, "with documentation." "Thorn, with documentation," Caleb repeated. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature. "And in daylight. You want to talk law, we talk law in daylight with paper in hand. You want to talk something else, then we're talking something else." Another pause, longer this time. Eleanor moved to the second window, the one in the bedroom, which gave a partial angle on the north side of the clearing. She could see 2 of the horses now. Dark shapes at the tree line, riders still mounted. One of the riders was broad enough across the shoulders to be memorable, even in the dark. She went back to the main room. 2 on the north side, she said quietly. They're flanking. Caleb absorbed this without visible reaction. "The root cellar door," he said. "Can you get to it from inside?" She thought about the layout. The root cellar had an interior access, a trapdoor in the floor of the small storage alcove off the main room, and the cellar itself extended under the north side of the cabin with an external door that opened flat to the ground on the outside, flush with the earth and covered in winter with a board and snow. In daylight, visible. In pre-dawn dark. With snow on it, possibly not. "Yes," she said. "If they come around north, they'll come to the barn first. The barn door faces east, away from the cabin. If someone goes through the cellar and comes out the external door, they're behind whoever's at the barn." She looked at him. "You want me to go around behind them?" "I want you to have the option," he said. "I'm not telling you to do anything, but if it goes badly in here and you need to move—" He stopped. "You know the ground better than they do. That matters." She did know the ground. 6 weeks of hauling water and checking fence lines and carrying wood in every light condition and every weather had built a map of this property into her body that 4 hired men in the dark did not have. "What's your plan for the front?" she said. "Talk as long as possible," he said. People who are talking aren't shooting, and people who are stalling at dawn usually mean they're waiting for light, which means they're not as confident in what they're doing as they're trying to sound. And if talking runs out? He looked at her. In the dark, she could see the outline of his face. Not the expression, but she'd been reading this man for 6 weeks, and she didn't need the expression. Then it runs out, he said. Outside, the voice came again, and this time there was a different quality to it, less controlled, more pressure in it, the tone of a man who had been told to accomplish something and was beginning to feel the shape of it not going as planned. Thorne, Whitmore says to tell you that the woman has an inheritance. He says you already know about it. He says you took her up here to get at it, and that makes you as liable as her in this matter. Caleb's jaw tightened briefly. Eleanor saw it. She can come out and this ends clean, the voice continued, or we come in and it ends different. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She nodded at him. Go ahead. She'll speak for herself, Caleb called back. A beat of silence. Eleanor moved to stand beside the door. She didn't open it. She put her back to the wall beside the frame and raised her voice. I'm Eleanor Hart. Miss Hart. The voice changed slightly, recalibrated, trying for a tone of reasonableness. You're not in trouble here. Mr. Whitmore is trying to protect your interests. The land you've inherited is being disputed in Denver. He has the means to help you establish your claim. By taking me off a mountain at 4 a.m, she said. A pause. The timing is unfortunate. There's urgency in Denver. I have legal representation in Denver, she said, which was a forward projection of what was currently true. She had written to the attorneys, and they had written back with 2 letters that were also in the lockbox, establishing formal representation. If Mr. Whitmore has concerns about my estate, he can address them through my attorneys. Miss Hart, and, she said, and her voice didn't waver because she had decided it wouldn't, I'm not a woman alone on this mountain, whatever he may have told you. I am here in a legal partnership on this homestead. My interests are protected. My property is protected. She paused. Are you men employees of Mr. Whitmore, or are you officers of the law? Silence. Because if you're employees, she continued, then what you're doing right now is not a legal matter. It's trespass. On my property, in the partnership I hold with Caleb Thorne, at 4 a.m. before any documentation has been presented. And you should think carefully about what that makes you party to. More silence. She could hear something, low voices, more than 2, the sound of men conferring at a distance they thought was private. Caleb was looking at her in the dark with an expression she couldn't fully see, but could feel. She didn't look back at him. She was listening to the men outside. The conference ended. It ended badly. The sound came fast. Boots on frozen ground, multiple people moving from multiple directions. Not the careful quiet of before, but the committed sound of men who had made a decision. Eleanor had 1 second of that sound before Caleb said, "Cellar," in a voice that was not loud and not panicked and meant exactly what it said. She went for the trapdoor. She had it open and was dropping into the root cellar in the same movement, pulling the trap closed above her, and she was in the dark and the cold of the underground with the smell of earth and stored vegetables around her, and the sound of what was happening above her coming through the floor in muffled percussion. The cabin door taking impact. Caleb's voice. Another voice, something falling. She did not allow herself to stop moving. The external cellar door was at the far end, 8 feet of low-ceilinged crawl through the dark, with her hands finding the shelves on either side by memory. She had been down here dozens of times. She knew where the floor dipped near the second shelf, and she knew where the door hinged, and she knew that the board over the outside would be frozen slightly to the frame and would require shoulder force to move. She got to the door, pressed her ear against it for 3 seconds. No sound directly above it. The sounds of the struggle were coming from the cabin, from the east side near the barn. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. The frozen edge cracked, and the door opened and she came out of the ground on the north side of the cabin in the dark with the hatchet in her hand, and she lay flat for a moment in the snow and let her eyes adjust to the outside dark, which was less dark than the cellar, but still the deep gray of pre-dawn, and she looked and listened and found the shape of the situation. One man at the cabin door, shoulder deep in trying to force it. Caleb must have barred it after she went under. It hadn't gone in easily. One man around the east side heading for the barn. 2 horses at the tree line, riders still mounted, watching. She could not see Caleb. The window on the north side showed no light and no movement. She did not let herself think about why that was. She came up from the ground quietly and moved along the north wall of the cabin toward the east corner. The man at the cabin door was focused entirely on the door, cursing at it in a low, frustrated way, working at the bar somehow, the way you worked at something you hadn't expected to be this hard. He hadn't seen her come up from the cellar. He hadn't looked north. She came around the east corner. The man at the barn was pulling the barn door open. He was inside before she got there, and she could hear the animals immediately. The horses going loud, Contrary's particular shrieking alarm, the mule moving in his stall with the wary energy she remembered from the blizzard night. The man was doing something in the barn, looking for something, searching. She could hear him moving through it. She stepped into the barn doorway. He spun. He was younger than she'd expected, 25 maybe, with the wide eyes of someone who had not anticipated the person he found in the doorway. He had a pistol, not leveled at her, held in his hand at his side in the way of a man who had not yet committed to using it. She had the hatchet. They looked at each other for 1 second. "Put it on the ground," she said. He had a moment. She could see it on his face, where he ran the calculation. She was a woman, and he had a gun, and he was 25 years old, and had likely never had a woman stand in a doorway and tell him what to do with a hatchet in her hand and mean it all the way through. Whatever he calculated, he got it wrong. He brought the pistol up. She was already moving, not at him, sideways into the space behind the door frame, and as she moved, she grabbed the nearest thing her hand found, which was the full water bucket hanging on the post beside the door, and she threw it. Not with aim, with force. The whole bucket, the water and the bucket itself, and it hit him across the face and shoulder in a wave of ice-cold water, and he flinched back hard, the gun going wide, and in the moment he was blind and off balance, she came at him. She didn't hit him with the hatchet, she hit him with her shoulder, all of her, all the weight and force that Gerald Whitmore had called too large and too rough on a train platform 2 months ago, driving him back into the barn wall with enough impact that the wall flexed and he went down, the pistol dropping, and she had her knee on his chest and the hatchet handle across his throat before he'd finished deciding what had happened. "Don't," she said. Just that. He didn't. She looked at his face. Young, scared, out of his depth in a way that he probably hadn't been when Whitmore was explaining the job. "How many of you?" she said. "4," he said, hoarse against the handle. "Who's the lead?" "Reardon. Big man. He swallowed. "He's at the front." "The 2 on horses?" "They're supposed to come in if—" He stopped. "If the first 2 couldn't handle it," she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She pressed the handle slightly. "You're done here," she said. "You understand me? You're done. You go back down that mountain and you don't come back up it, and you tell Whitmore that this didn't work and nothing he sends up here is going to work. You tell him exactly what happened to you in this barn." She leaned in slightly. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "If I let you up and you go for the gun." "I won't." She studied him for 3 more seconds. Then she stood back and kicked the pistol into the far corner of the barn, behind the hay bales where finding it in the dark would take a while. She kept the hatchet in her hand and she kept her eyes on him while he got up, slowly, soaking wet from the water bucket and shaking with cold or adrenaline or both. "Go," she said. He went. She came out of the barn behind him, and in the gray light that was now, finally, shifting toward the palest edge of dawn, she could see the yard more clearly. The man who had been at the cabin door was not at the cabin door anymore. He was standing 10 feet into the yard facing the porch, and on the porch was Caleb, and Caleb had the rifle. The man in the yard had his hands up. His name, she would learn later, was Reardon, and he was large across the shoulders in the way she'd noticed from the north window. And he had the look of a man who was genuinely angry, but was not angry enough to be stupid about a rifle at 10 feet. He was saying something to Caleb in a low, pressurized voice, and Caleb was saying nothing in return, which was the correct response to that particular tone. Eleanor came around to the side of the yard where she had a clear angle. Reardon saw her. He looked at her for a moment, at the hatchet in her hand, at whatever was on her face, and then he looked back at Caleb, and something in him shifted. "Call your men off the horses," Caleb said. First thing he'd said, apparently, from the way Reardon's head moved. "They're not going to—" "Call them off," Caleb said, "or I'll do the talking for you." Reardon turned his head toward the tree line and raised his hand in a flat downward gesture. The two mounted men at the edge of the clearing held for a moment, and Eleanor watched them while she watched Reardon, splitting her attention in the way the blizzard night had taught her, the way 6 weeks of being responsible for things on multiple sides of a property had made natural. The mounted men conferred briefly. Then one of them turned his horse and the other followed, and they moved back into the tree line and out of sight. She did not make the mistake of thinking they were gone, but they were no longer an immediate problem. The barn door was still open behind her, and she heard the young man's horse leave from the back of the barn. The sound of him going around the far side of the property rather than crossing the yard, which told her he was not interested in testing whether Caleb would shoot and she would swing, and that was good information about his judgment. Reardon stood in the yard with his hand still raised and the rifle still pointed at him, and he looked at Eleanor and he looked at Caleb, and he made the assessment of a man who had arrived with a plan and found the plan substantially worse than advertised. Whitmore said there was one man up here, he said, and he wasn't talking to either of them specifically, just saying it, the way people said things when they were recalibrating. He was wrong about that too, Eleanor said. Reardon's eyes moved to her. He said you were... I know what he said I was. She let that sit. He's been wrong about me since October. I'd have thought someone would have told him that by now. Reardon lowered his hand slightly. Caleb didn't lower the rifle. The situation had a clear shape, and everyone in the yard understood it. You take something back to Whitmore, Caleb said. His voice was the same voice he used to call the livestock, flat and carrying, and entirely certain of itself. You tell him Eleanor Hart is here by her own choice. You tell him this is a legal partnership on legally held land and that she has legal representation for her estate in Denver. You tell him the next time someone comes up this mountain without documentation, and in the dark, we stop being patient about it. He's not going to... Reardon began. I don't care what he's going to do, Caleb said. I care what you're going to do, right now. A pause. Which is get on your horse and go down. Reardon stood there for another 5 seconds, which was the right amount of time for a man to put away his pride without it looking like he'd dropped it in a hurry. Then he turned and walked to where his horse was tied at the tree line, and he mounted, and he looked back at the yard once, at Caleb with the rifle, and Eleanor with the hatchet in the early gray light of a December morning. And then he rode. Eleanor stood in the yard and listened to the horses go. All 4 of them, eventually, the sounds diminishing down the switchbacks until the mountain swallowed them. She became aware slowly that her hands were shaking. Not from cold, she'd been in cold worse than this, but from the other thing, the thing that always came after, the delayed arrival of the body's honest accounting of what it had just been through. She put the hatchet down, blade first into the snow, and let her hands shake. Caleb came off the porch. He stood beside her in the yard, and he looked down the trail where the riders had gone, and he said nothing for a long moment. The man in the barn, he said eventually. Gone. I sent him. She paused. He was young. He wasn't a killer. He was just hired. You got his gun? In the hay, back corner. I'll get it in daylight. He nodded. He was looking at her hands, she realized, the slight tremor in them. He didn't comment on it. He just reached out and put his hand over both of hers, one brief and solid pressure, and then he let go. Come inside, he said. She picked up the hatchet, and they went in. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down in the chaos, and nobody had tended it. And Caleb went to the stove, and she stood at the table, and they both did the ordinary things, because the ordinary things were what you held on to when everything else had been irregular. She put wood on the stove. He put water on. She sat down at the table, and after a moment he sat across from her, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not an absence of communication, but a different kind of it. He knew about the inheritance before Arden came up here, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Caleb said. The letter was already read by the time it got to you. Arden was a test, to see if you'd come down quietly. And when I didn't, he had a few weeks to put something together. Caleb looked at the table. He moved faster than you calculated. 4 days faster. You're not wrong about that, just early. He paused. It changes things. He'll try again. Probably not himself, Caleb said. He hired 4 men, and 4 men came back without you. He's a businessman. He calculates odds. He looked up. But he might find another angle. Legal pressure in Denver, maybe. Someone in the land office who'll question the inheritance before it's finalized. Eleanor thought about the attorney's letters in the lockbox. The correspondence she'd maintained through December, carefully documented, with dates and signatures. The ledger. The record of her presence here, her labor here, her stake in this place. I need to go to Denver, she said. Caleb looked at her. Not now, when the pass is open. But I need to go in person. I need to be in front of the attorneys, in front of whoever processes the estate, so that there's no question about who I am and what I'm claiming, and that I'm doing it freely. She looked at him. Whitmore can't use the legal system against me if I'm already inside it. Spring, Caleb said. Spring, she agreed. Dion. The water on the stove began to steam. She got up and made the coffee the way she made it every morning, strong and plain, and she set his cup in front of him and sat back down with hers. And they sat in the warming cabin while the December light came up fully outside and made the snow on the yard bright. You came out of the cellar behind them, Caleb said. It was not an accusation. It was the tone he used when he was thinking about something from the outside. You told me to have the option. I did. He was quiet for a moment. I heard the barn door. I heard the horse leave. He looked at his cup. I didn't know what that meant until you came around the corner of the barn. She looked at him. Were you worried? He met her eyes. He held them for a moment, which was not something he did casually. Yes, he said. She didn't look away. I was fine. I can see that. The young man was scared, she said. He wasn't prepared for someone who didn't behave the way he expected. No, Caleb said. I expect he wasn't. She drank her coffee. Outside, the morning was fully arrived, cold and clear, the sky a hard blue above the white peaks. The yard was marked with tracks, boots and hooves in the snow, the record of what had happened before dawn. And she would look at those marks all day, and they would be a reminder, but they would also fade, and the snow was still clean on the far pasture and the barn roof and the slopes above the timberline, all the places the 4 hired men had not gone. The fire was going properly now. The cabin was warming. There was a gun in the hay in the barn that needed retrieving, and tracks in the yard that needed reading for what they told her about the approach, and a letter that needed to be written to the attorneys in Denver, laying out exactly what had happened this morning in clear documentary terms. She would write it today, while the details were sharp. She opened the ledger on the table in front of her. She turned to that day's page. She wrote the date. Below it, she wrote what had happened, factually and in order, the way you wrote things you needed to be true on paper. Names where she had them, descriptions where she didn't, sequence and time as accurately as she could fix them. She wrote, 4 riders, pre-dawn, turn back. No injuries. She looked at that last line, then she added, partnership held. She closed the ledger. Across the table, Caleb had his hands around his cup and was looking out the window at the white yard, at the tracks in the snow, at the mountain above the homestead doing what the mountain always did, which was stand there and not particularly care about any of it. And Eleanor looked at him, looking at it, and she thought about spring and Denver and the thing they had built here on this ground that 4 men in the dark had not been able to take. Spring came the way Caleb had always said it did. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with winter, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. A week of warmth followed by a late snow, followed by another week of warmth that held a little longer than the last. By mid-March, the lower trail was passable in the mornings before the melt softened the ground, and by April the passes to Denver were open enough that the stage was running again, and Eleanor had been ready for both of those things since February. The letter she'd written the morning after Reardon's visit had gone down the mountain with Caleb on his next supply run, and the attorneys in Denver had written back within 3 weeks. A fast turnaround that told her they understood the situation had urgency to it. Their letter was careful and formal, and between its lines, she could read exactly what she needed to read. The estate was legitimate, her claim was solid, and there were indeed interested parties in Denver making noise about the land, though none of them had any legal standing that a clear inheritance couldn't overrule. Come in person, the letter said. Bring documentation. We will handle the rest. She had spent the winter months building that documentation into something that could not be questioned. The ledger had grown to 2 volumes, a record of her presence and labor on the homestead from her first day, witnessed by Caleb's countersignature on each weekly summary, the way they'd started doing it after the night of Reardon's visit, because written evidence was harder to argue with than a person's word. She had the attorney's correspondence, dated and organized. She had a letter from Mrs. Putnam at the boarding house in Dunmore's Creek, attesting to Eleanor's arrival date and circumstances, which she'd requested through Caleb's next supply run and received back in January. Mrs. Putnam, whatever her opinions about unfortunate women and their poor decisions, was apparently unwilling to lie on paper for a merchant she didn't particularly like, and she had the original inheritance letter, preserved in the lockbox through everything. She had also spent part of the winter learning the rifle properly, the way she'd asked. Caleb had been a patient teacher, which surprised her given that patience was not the first quality she'd have named in him, until she realized that his patience was specific. He had none of it for things he considered inefficiency or evasion, and a great deal of it for things that required careful building. Teaching was the latter. He corrected her without condescension, and he was honest when she got something wrong, and he told her once, after a session in which she'd finally found the consistency she'd been working toward for 3 weeks, that she had a natural steadiness that most people had to practice for years. She hadn't told him that she thought the steadiness came from having nothing left to lose, and then gradually from having things to protect, and that those two states produced the same outward stillness for entirely different internal reasons. Some things she kept to herself still. Not out of secrecy, but out of the understanding that not every thought needed an audience. The other thing that happened that winter, the thing that neither of them discussed directly but that both of them understood was happening, was that the nature of the partnership shifted in some interior way that left the surface of it looking approximately the same work, the same rhythms, the same division of the day's labor. But underneath that, something else, something that had been building since the barn during the blizzard and the night of her hands shaking and his covering them briefly and then letting go. It came to a head, as these things do, not dramatically, but in a small moment on an ordinary evening in late February, when she was at the table with the ledger and he came in from the barn and said her name in a way that was different from the way he usually said it. And she looked up, and he was standing in the middle of the room with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who had clearly been working up to something for longer than this particular evening. "I want to say something," he said. She closed the ledger. She waited. "When you go to Denver," he said, "when this is settled, the inheritance and the attorneys and all of it." He turned the hat in his hands. "You'll have options you don't have now, real ones." "I know that," she said. "I want you to know that I don't—" He stopped, started again. "The partnership was what I could offer in October, what was fair to offer. You were in a bad situation and I had a need, and I was honest about that." He looked at her. "What I want to say is that it's not the only thing that's—" He was not, she had learned, a man who struggled for words as a general rule. He said what he meant, and he said it plainly, and the fact that he was struggling now told her more than the words themselves. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. He held her gaze. "Do you?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I've known for a while. I've been waiting to see if you'd get around to it." Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been braced against a certain outcome and has to readjust when it doesn't arrive. And she thought about October and the train platform and the specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. And she thought about 6 months of splitting wood and patching roofs and sitting in a barn in a blizzard and coming out of a root cellar in the dark with a hatchet. And she thought about a ledger with 2 volumes of evidence that she had been here, fully here, every day. "And I'm not going anywhere," she said, "except Denver and then back." He nodded once, the slow nod of a man settling something inside himself. Then he hung up his coat and hat and sat down at the table across from her and said, "Show me where you are in the ledger." And they spent the rest of that evening going through the numbers together, which was not the most romantic conclusion to that conversation, but it was honest, and between the two of them, honest had always been worth more than romantic. She went to Denver in April. Caleb rode down the mountain with her and waited in Dunmore's Creek while she took the stage east. Gerald Whitmore's store was open when they came through town. She saw him through the window as they passed, saw him see her, saw the flicker of something in his face that she had no interest in reading anymore. He didn't come out. She didn't stop. Denver was larger than she'd expected, and louder than anything she'd encountered since Cincinnati, and she spent her first hour there feeling slightly overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of people operating in close proximity, which told her something about what 6 months on a mountain had done to her tolerances. She found the attorney's office on the third street she tried, a solid brick building with a painted sign, and she walked in with her documentation under her arm and her back straight, and she told the man behind the desk exactly who she was and what she had come to accomplish. The attorneys were efficient. They were also, once they had reviewed her documentation, quite clear about the situation. Her claim was unambiguous. The estate had been in probate for 6 months, but the paperwork was clean, the will was valid, the land was hers. The interested parties that had been making noise turned out to be 2 land speculators and a railroad company representative who had been trying to get at the parcel during the probate period in hopes that a disorganized or distant heir could be pressured into a disadvantageous sale. Eleanor's presence and her documentation shut that down in a single afternoon meeting. She sat across a wide desk from a railroad company representative who was 20 years older than her and wore a very expensive coat, and she listened to his offer and she said, politely and without any particular heat, "That's not what the land is worth, and we both know it. Give me the actual number." He looked at her for a moment. Then he gave her a number that was significantly larger. "That's closer," she said. "Not there yet." They went back and forth 3 times. She knew what she was doing because she had spent February with a copy of the Denver land records that the attorneys had mailed her, and she had studied the comparable sales around the survey corridor until she knew them the way she knew the homestead fence line, by feel, by memory, by the particular knowledge that came from having paid attention to something long enough that it stopped being abstract. She left the railroad company representative's office with a signed letter of intent at a number that made the attorneys raise their eyebrows when she showed them. "You've done this before?" the senior attorney said. "No," she said, "but I've been doing arithmetic in a ledger all winter, and I'm not bad at it." She spent 3 days in Denver. She signed the estate documents. She met with the land office and registered her claim in her own name, witnessed and stamped and recorded. She opened a bank account, the first she had ever held, and she deposited the first portion of the estate settlement that had been held in trust through the probate, not the railroad sale, which would close in the summer when the survey was finalized, but the liquid portion, the money her uncle had kept in a Denver bank that came to her directly once the inheritance was legally established. She stood in the bank lobby after and looked at the paper in her hand for a long moment. She thought about the textile mill in Cincinnati, the room she'd shared with 2 women and a cat, the matrimonial advertisement that had cost her a week's wages and had taken 3 drafts to write because she'd kept trying to sound like more than she was, and then finally decided to just say what was true. The train that had smelled like coal smoke and wet wool. The platform. She folded the bank paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and she walked back to the hotel she'd been staying at, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the room she'd been paying for with money she'd earned on the homestead from the partnership share Caleb had been setting aside for her in cash since November. And she did not cry. She sat with it. All of it. The whole length of it from October to now. She had not become someone different. That was the thing she kept coming back to, sitting in that hotel room in Denver. She had not been remade or rescued or transformed by circumstance into something she hadn't been before. She was the same woman who had stood on that platform. The same size, the same broad hands, the same tendency to read a situation fast and practical and without much sentiment. The things that had made Gerald Whitmore curl his lip were still exactly the same things she brought into a room. They were just, finally, in a room that needed them. That was not a small distinction. She had spent most of her life being told, in various explicit and implicit ways, that the problem was her size, her manner, her unwillingness to perform the softness that other people wanted from her. What she understood now, sitting in Denver in April with a bank paper in her pocket and 6 months of mountain winter behind her, was that the problem had never been her. The problem had been the rooms. She had been trying to fit into spaces that were built for a different shape of person, and the waste of all those years was not that she'd failed to fit. The waste was how long it had taken her to stop trying. She went back to Dunmore's Creek on the Saturday stage, and Caleb met her at the post station with the horses, and she stepped off the stage and he looked at her face and read it the way he'd learned to read it, and he said, "Done." "Done," she said. "All of it?" All of it. She took the reins from him. I'll tell you on the trail. They rode back up the mountain together, and she told him everything. The attorneys, the railroad representative, the land office, the bank. And he listened with the focused attention he gave to anything with practical implications, asking 2 or 3 precise questions at the points where the account needed clarification. And she gave him the numbers because they were his business too, as her partner, and because she did not believe in keeping important things in only one person's head. When she finished, they rode for a while without talking, which was their way. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" She had been thinking about this since the hotel room in Denver. "The railroad money closes in summer," she said. "That's the large portion. I want to use part of it to expand the homestead. Another 40 acres adjacent on the east slope. I've been looking at it since December. Good timber, decent pasture potential. A second barn, eventually. More livestock." She looked at the mountain above them, the peaks coming into view as they climbed, the familiar line of them that she had woken up to every morning since October. "I want to build something here that lasts past us." Caleb was quiet. "I know that's not what you expected me to say," she said. "It's exactly what I expected you to say," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the trail ahead, but there was something in his profile that was the closest thing she'd ever seen on his face to uncomplicated happiness. Not performed, not demonstrated, just present. "There's one other thing," she said. He waited. "I want to change the legal structure of the partnership," she said. "Not the practical terms. Those work. But the paper it's on." She kept her voice even. "I want it to be the kind of paper that's harder to challenge, that gives us both full standing." She paused. "You know what I'm saying?" He turned to look at her. "Are you asking me something?" "I'm stating a preference," she said. "You can respond to it however seems right to you." He held her gaze for a moment. This man who had never once told her what to do or who to be, who had stood on a porch with a rifle while she came up out of the ground behind 4 hired men in the dark, who had put water on for her coffee every morning for 6 months without being asked, and had never once treated her strength as a problem to be managed. "That seems right to me," he said. She nodded. They rode on. They married in June at the homestead, with Peterson and his wife and new baby as witnesses, Peterson having come back up the mountain for the summer work as promised, and his wife having turned out to be a woman named Ruth who had opinions about everything and said them all directly, which Eleanor appreciated in people. The ceremony was brief and practical and performed by a circuit judge who came through the valley twice a year and charged a reasonable fee and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Eleanor wore her best dress, which she had made herself that spring from cloth she'd bought in Dunmore's Creek on the last supply run. A dark blue wool that was not fancy but was good, and she had taken care with it. Ruth had looked at the dress and said, "You made that yourself?" And Eleanor had said yes, and Ruth had said, "That's better than anything I could have bought in Cincinnati." And Eleanor had thought, with a feeling she didn't try to name, "Yes, well, I have had some practice at making what I need out of what's available." Gerald Whitmore made one more attempt. It came in May, before the railroad sale closed, in the form of a legal filing in Denver that claimed Eleanor had been under coercion when she established her estate claim, that Caleb Thorne had held undue influence over her, that she had not acted freely, that the claim should be reviewed. The attorneys notified her within the week. She wrote a response herself, 3 pages, factual and specific, citing dates and documentation and the legal record of her own correspondence independent of anyone else. Letters she had sent from Denver in her own hand, accounts opened in her own name, decisions made and documented before she had discussed them with anyone. She attached the ledger entries. She attached Mrs. Putnam's letter. She attached the letter from the railroad representative with her negotiated figures on it, which she thought made the clearest possible argument that she was a woman who made her own decisions. The filing was dismissed in 2 weeks. She didn't hear Whitmore's name again after that. She knew he was still in Dunmore's Creek. She went through the town occasionally, on necessary trips, and she was aware of his presence the way you were aware of a bad winter you'd already survived. He had staked his understanding of her on a platform in October, and he had been wrong about every single part of it, and she thought that probably sat with him in ways she didn't need to concern herself with anymore. She had stopped giving him space in her mind somewhere around the Denver trip, and she saw no reason to let him back in. The East Slope 40 acres came through in July. Caleb and Peterson broke ground on the second barn in August. And Eleanor spent that month going back and forth to the Dunmore's Creek land office so many times that the clerk there knew her by name and had her paperwork ready before she asked. The homestead grew. The ledger grew with it. A third volume by autumn. The accounts of a place that had become, in the course of a year, something more substantial than one man's isolated refuge on the side of a mountain. She thought sometimes about what she had been building toward without knowing it all those years before Colorado. All those years of being too large, too rough, too unwilling to be small enough. She thought about the mill and the room and the cat that didn't belong to anyone, and the advertisement she'd written 3 times before she said the plain, true thing: capable woman, not afraid of hard work, reliable. She had written that as a bare minimum, a factual description stripped of any pretension. She had not known that it was, in its plainness, a more accurate portrait of her actual worth than anything she could have dressed it up to be. The mountain in October looked different from the mountain in October of the previous year. Or rather, it looked the same. The aspens going gold, the first hard cold in the mornings, the sky that particular blue that meant the season was committing. But she was different within it. She stood on the porch in the early morning of the anniversary of her arrival, and she looked at the eastern peaks and she felt the cold on her face, and she thought, here, not here as in this place, though that too. Here as in finally arrived. Here as in the specific feeling of being in the right place in the right way, doing the right work for the right reasons, which was something she had not known she was missing until she found it and recognized it by the particular weight of its absence finally lifting. Caleb came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee the way he always did, and he handed her one, and he stood beside her and looked at the same mountains, and they were quiet together in the morning the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not silence, but a different kind of speech. Same time last year, she said. Yes. She thought about the train platform, the cold street corner, the receipt for a paid debt, and a man she'd never met offering her something he called a partnership. She thought about all the ways that could have gone wrong and hadn't. You made a good investment, she said. He looked at her with the thing that had, over a year, become simply how his face looked when he looked at her. Not performed warmth, not demonstrated affection, just the unguarded expression of a man looking at something he was glad exists. Yes, he said. I did. She drank her coffee. The mountain was doing what the mountain did, which was stand there in the cold morning light and not particularly care about any of it, and she understood now that this was the thing she had needed all along. Not a place that would celebrate her or excuse her or reshape her into something more convenient, but a place that simply required what she actually had to give and let her give it. That was enough. It was, she had come to understand, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that most people never found, and the fact that she had found it by way of humiliation and abandonment and a December blizzard and 4 men in the dark did not make it less real or less hers. If anything, it made it more so, because she knew exactly what it had cost, and she had paid every part of that cost herself. The aspens on the east slope, her east slope now, the new 40 acres, were gold against the dark pine, the same as they had been last October, the same as they would be next October, and she stood on the porch of a home she had helped build and looked at them, and she did not look back. She had a rule about that.